Today, we're diving deep into one of the most painful psychological paradoxes out there.
Mhm.
What happens when that drive to help, to be compassionate or even to sacrifice for someone gets twisted into a trap?
Right.
We're exploring that territory where compassion doesn't just blur into codependency, but into, well, outright control and even abuse. We've got a really dense and I think incredibly critical stack of sources for you today. We're linking these deep-seated psychological
The
concepts.
fixer mentality martyr complex.
Exactly. Pathological helping, linking them directly to the severe cyclical reality of traumatic bonding and intimate partner violence.
And our sources really force us to look critically at how systems of power reinforce these dynamics.
That's right. Our mission here is so crucial because we have to move past that simplistic question of, well, why don't they just leave?
Yeah, it's never that simple. It's not. We have to understand that staying in these profoundly destructive relationships isn't a choice, not a simple one anyway. It's the result of these insidious cycles of dependency, power imbalance, and a really distorted sense of self-worth.
So we're dissecting how that impulse to be indispensable can be, I guess, co-opted and weaponized. Okay, let's unpack this. We should start by looking inward at the personality structures that can make a person vulnerable.
Right.
And the first one that just jumps off the page is the fixer mentality.
The fixer, yeah. The fixer is often driven by this overwhelming, sometimes frantic urge to solve other people's
And
problems,
they do it without being asked.
often completely unsolicited.
Hmm.
And this isn't rooted in simple goodwill. It's frequently fueled by perfectionism, a desperate need for control, or, and this is crucial, an unconscious attempt to fix their own damaged sense of self.
Which usually goes back to childhood.
Often, yeah, tracing back to trauma or some kind of dysfunction.
So if I'm hearing you right, for the fixer, the goal isn't actually the person they're helping. It's the validation they get from being needed.
Precisely. And that leads to what the sources call the fixer's dilemma.
Okay.
The fixer is trying to feel whole by completing someone else, right?
Sure.
But their constant intervention, it undermines the other person's independence. It creates dependency
So it guarantees resentment.
for everyone involved, yeah. The recipient feels incapable, and the fixer feels drained, unappreciated, and that just fuels the whole cycle all over again.
And when this need to be useful crosses a line, when it becomes compulsive and self-destructive, we move into something called pathological altruism.
This is a really critical distinction.
Yeah.
Pathological altruism is that excessive, compulsive helping that ultimately harms the helper.
How does that play out?
We see it as chronic self-neglect, severe burnout, and just this utter inability to set boundaries or say no.
And the engine behind it.
It's the belief that their entire self-worth is tied to being useful. The idea that if they stop giving, they just cease to exist.
Yeah.
And it's often deeply connected to anxious attachment styles, where the person fears abandonment if they aren't constantly indispensable.
That sounds a lot like a more sophisticated term for what we used to call the martyr complex. That person who's always suffering, always sacrificing, and making sure everyone knows it.
The March complex is definitely the shadow side of self-sacrifice. It's a pattern of seeking out suffering or persecution, often in the name of love or duty.
You see it a lot in codependent dynamics.
A lot. And your sources even discuss it in these extreme psychological terms, almost as a form of masochism. The suffering itself becomes the source of meaning.
The problem is, while the martyr feels morally superior, they just drain the energy from everyone around them. So we've defined the psychological drive, this person who is operating out of a wound. But here's the pivot point for me. How do these noble instincts stop being about healing and start becoming an active tool of dominance in a relationship?
This is where we have to shift our focus from just individual psychology to power dynamics. What's fascinating here is that the mere act of helping often signifies a relationship of unequal power.
Huh. Because the helper has more resources.
By definition, yes. More resources, less need, higher status in that moment. And if that help isn't designed to empower the other person, if it's just a Band-Aid, it structurally perpetuates dependency.
So the aid itself becomes a signal. It says, you are weak and I am necessary. It's a setup for exploitation.
Precisely. The sources detail exactly how this kind of covert control operates under the guise of kindness. The tactics are so insidious.
Like what?
Well, controllers might overplan the recipient's life, their schedule, their money, who they see eroding their autonomy, all while saying it's just to make things more efficient.
Or offering unsolicited advice constantly, which carries that little implied message, your judgment is faulty, you can't handle this without me.
You also see classic financial manipulation, offering financial support, but with these subtle yet ironclad strings attached. That gift is really an agreement for compliance. It's a leash.
Hmm.
And finally, taking over tasks to help, even when the other person is perfectly capable, which sends the constant message, you're not capable. It's all designed to collapse the victim's internal boundaries.
And that boundary dissolution, that's what Mnuchin called enmeshment, right?
Right.
Where the personal lines get so blurry that you lose any autonomous development.
Yes, it's that psychological state where it becomes impossible for the dependent person to know where they end and the controller begins.
It's a powerful concept.
A very powerful concept for understanding unhealthy dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to bring in the nuance from your sources, specifically the feminist critique.
Ah.
Critics note that just applying the label enmeshment can sometimes pathologize relational styles preferred by women, calling them dysfunctional when they might just be different.
That's a crucial point. We can't just stamp every high cohesion family as dysfunctional because it doesn't fit a Western, highly individualistic idea of boundaries.
Exactly. I mean, one study found that young women with strong family cohesion, which could easily be labeled enmeshment, actually showed the highest social self-esteem. So we had to be careful not to label connection as pathology unless it's actively preventing growth and causing real distress.
Okay, so now we have to confront the most severe and frankly devastating application of all these patterns, the creation of a traumatic bond within intimate partner violence.
Traumatic bonding. As defined in the literature, it's this deep, intense emotional attachment an abused person has for their abuser, despite everything, despite the repeated cycles of violence and harm.
It's often compared to Stockholm Syndrome.
There are elements, yes. The psychological dynamics are forged in the intensity and the sheer irregularity of the trauma. The victim starts to confuse that intensity with intimacy.
And the mechanism that locks this bond in place is that insidious four-part cycle of violence theory.
Right, from Lenore Walker. The cycle starts with tension building. The abuser's stress is rising, and the victim becomes hypervigilant, just walking on eggshells, trying to placate them.
Trying to avoid the inevitable.
Exactly. Then comes the incident, the violent outburst, whether it's physical, verbal, emotional, and the abuser discharges all that tension and, of course, blames the victim.
But then comes the phase that reinforces the entire attachment, the reconciliation phase, the so-called honeymoon.
This is the psychological engine of the bond. The abuser shows overwhelming affection, guilt, makes these fervent promises to change.
And this is where love bombing comes in.
This is classic love bombing, an excessive display of affection and generosity used specifically to manipulate to quell the victim's desire to leave. It's often driven by the abuser's own deep fear of abandonment.
And then for a little while, the calm period. And that piece reinforces the victim's hope that the abuser is, deep down, the person they fell in love with.
That hope is what keeps them anchored, yeah. It makes them overlook the fact that the violent incidents are getting more frequent and more intense over time.
Which brings us to a devastating reality. I mean, given the intensity of this bond, the studies say leaving an abusive relationship takes an average of 5 to 7 attempts.
It's not because the victim doesn't want to leave. It's because the barriers are layers, they're interconnected, and often they are quite literally life-threatening.
The most immediate barrier being just fear. Fear of retribution. The time you try to leave is statistically the most dangerous moment.
The statistics are horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
They really underline why fear is the primary determinant. Studies found that women have a 70 times increased chance of being killed in the weeks right after leaving.
70 times.
70, compared to any other time in the relationship.
Wow.
And the danger extends outward. 20% of homicide victims in these cases aren't the primary victim, but family members or people who tried to help.
And that doesn't even count other forms of violence.
No. When you consider the cultural context and some of the sources, like the documented fear of acid attacks, India reports hundreds of these a year, the choice to stay can feel like a rational act of self-preservation.
And beyond the physical danger, the economic constraints create this inescapable lock-in.
Absolutely. Financial dependence was cited by 60% of the women in one study sample.
60%.
Yeah. Economic abuse, controlling their money, not letting them work, it makes leaving nearly impossible, especially with children. Autonomy requires resources, and the abuser systematically takes those away.
And then there's the invisible, suffocating weight of patriarchy and social conditioning. 40% of the women reported this.
This is that ideological structure that says a woman's worth is tied to her endurance, to preserving the family reputation, no matter the cost.
There was that one quote in the source material that was just devastating.
I know the one you mean. After being wedded off, A daughter can only come back to her maiden home as a corpse on a bier.
I mean.
That is the institutional pressure that isolates the victim from the very people who could help her.
And compounding all of this is the systematic psychological erosion. The mind itself gets hijacked.
Exactly. Repeated, unavoidable trauma leads to learned helplessness, where you start to believe escape is just futile. Constant criticism creates a damaged self-concept, where you internalize the abuse and believe you deserve it.
And the relentless psychological abuse we all know as gaslighting reinforces that dependence.
We all know the term, but the sources break down the specific techniques. Things like withholding, where they refuse to listen, countering, where they constantly question your memory, and trivializing, making you feel like your emotions are irrational.
It's all designed to just dismantle your sense of reality.
Completely. So you become utterly reliant on the abuser's perception of the world. And on top of all that, you can't forget that 40% of the women surveyed reported just a critical lack of awareness about what even constitutes non-physical abuse or what resources were even available to them.
It truly is a perfect storm. The external dangers stop you from leaving physically, while the psychological abuse stops you from leaving mentally. So if dependency and a damaged self-concept are the abuser's primary tools, what's the essential human need that has to be rebuilt to break that cycle?
The antidote is the restoration of mattering. Yeah, that profound feeling that we are valued and that we have genuine value to add to the world. It's a fundamental human need. It goes so much deeper than just belonging.
How so?
Belonging is about fitting in. Mattering is about knowing that your presence, your contributions, your needs, that they truly count to the people around you.
That distinction is so important because when you're being gaslit, you are constantly getting signals of anti-mattering. You're invisible, your feelings don't count. So how do you start building that back?
Well, mattering has two essential ingredients. The first is feeling valued.
Being seen.
Being seen, recognition, attunement. It's built in childhood from responsive serve and return interactions. When a cue is met with acknowledgement, it sparks reward chemicals in the brain. It affirms our significance.
And the second ingredient is adding value.
This is the part that builds self-efficacy. It's the sense that others genuinely rely on you. And your source is a great example of this. Calling a child a helper, which is an intrinsic trait, versus just thanking them for helping, which is a one-time action.
So you're reinforcing it as part of their identity.
Exactly. You're strengthening the mindset that their contribution is an essential, valued part of who they are.
So having a high sense of mattering basically functions as a protective shield against the kind of psychological destruction we've been talking about.
Absolutely. A strong sense of mattering protects against poor health. It reduces the effects of chronic stress, what they call the allostatic load, and it actively counteracts those signals of anti-mattering. It's the foundation for autonomous self-worth.
And finally, there's a critical societal implication here, which the sources call the spillover crossover effect.
This phenomenon highlights that when adults' own sense of mattering is under strain, from work stress, financial instability, whatever, their emotional availability just plummets. And that negatively impacts the children in their care.
So it's a cycle.
It's a cycle. The takeaway is clear. We can't just treat individual trauma in a vacuum. Building an ecosystem where adults feel valued and supported is an essential step in making sure everyone can thrive.
This has been a profound deep dive. We've gone from the self-destructive impulse of the fixer through the covert tactics of control into the devastating cycle of traumatic bonding, and finally landed on the protective power of mattering. It really shows that these things, fixation, control, vulnerability, they aren't just isolated relationship quirks. They're complex psychological patterns reinforced by powerful social structures.
And I think we can summarize the path forward is this. Healing requires transforming that learned dependency back into autonomous self-worth. And that demands setting firm boundaries, cultivating some radical self-compassion, and insisting on genuinely assertive communication.
That is the crucial personal work. But given the overwhelming evidence we just reviewed that dependency, fear, and a catastrophic lack of resources are what keep people trapped, it raises a powerful question for you, the listener, to carry forward. What specific collective efforts, beyond individual therapy, are required to build the economic and social safety nets that genuinely empower autonomy and self-determination for the most vulnerable, ensuring they can leave not just psychologically, but physically and financially?